Well, hello again and welcome to the show. My guest today is David Mahon. David is from Mahon China Investment Management Limited and is a China old hand, so to speak. He's been in China now about 4 decades or a little bit more without giving too much away. Welcome to the show, David.
Thanks, Warwick.
And it's great to see you again. And what I really wanted to do was pick your brains really on your 4 decades plus of lived experience in economic development, in interactions socially, in getting out and about across China from the big cities to the small places during the period of your time there, and to perhaps shed some light on what are the lessons to be learned from this development experience that could be applicable for people and places outside of China as much as anything else. So tell us a little bit about how you ended up or how you started out in China, and then the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Warwick, and thank you for having me on your YouTube channel. I delight in sharing my own understanding and experience of China. I don't think so much to promote anything, but it has been an extraordinary privilege, and people who are sincerely interested are really worth communicating with, particularly these days when China is so misunderstood. I arrived in China in my 20s. It was 1984. I arrived with a New Zealand company that was actually furnishing the first high-rise building in China. It was the Great Wall Hotel in Beijing. So I spent some months on that building site, and the seed of what turned into a lifetime here was mixing with those workers. There were 5 New Zealand tradesmen, including myself, and there were 2,000 Chinese construction workers. And although Beijing then was not an example of Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms, there was no private business. There were a handful of privately run restaurants that were just noodle shops, but that was it. Nothing in terms of what was happening at the same time in, say, Shenzhen or even Xiamen. So this was communist China. This was China that had no free market. But I sensed amongst the workers, and remember, these are construction workers, pay is low, although I did observe education was high, level of culture was high. You know, I'd worked in various circumstances in New Zealand, Australia, the United Kingdom beforehand. And what I found interesting about working people in China was the level of culture, where you would, through an interpreter in those days, you would end up in a conversation around Chinese poetry, something about society, in a way that was, I suppose, more self-observant. They were being self-observant of their own society. But what I sensed most was a tremendous need, a drive. It wasn't for running their own business. It wasn't for some capitalist nirvana. No one knew what that was then. They just wanted a better living standard. And I guess they had aspirations for their kids. But it was interacting with those people that really deeply affected me. And I had this view, and in your 20s, perceptions are simplistic. And it was, this country is where things are going to grow and change. I didn't foresee anything. I couldn't foresee the impact of Deng's economic reforms. There was no examples around of what was actually happening in a market sense. But it was that not human aspiration in a general sense, like in a developed country. It wasn't a greed. It was a need, a human need to evolve. And I've never felt that same energy anywhere else in the world. And our business has meant we've had clients all across the world. And I've spent long periods in the States and Europe tending to their needs and relating to China. But that experience then is something which decided me I would try and stay here and build something and stay and be part of this big human change. So with that, and I won't bother you with the iterations of how slowly I put a business together, but I worked out that was the right context within which to do something like this. I didn't have the intellectual training relevant to China. to do anything in teaching or anything in your field. And I had no profound qualification to work for multinationals. So I built a business myself. I suppose our business has reflected the opportunism with which the Chinese market unfolded. And so various things dealing with factories. I went back to New Zealand. I secured some mandates, which allowed me to go looking for industrial parts for international companies. Long periods on trains, being paid not much, but enough to exist in Beijing. And there were years of doing those things, very incremental. There was very little interest in China in those days. But each one of those excursions, and the longer I spent here, trying in an ad hoc way to learn the language, I got a deeper sense that there were tremendous rhythms within Chinese society changing things. And it dawned on me they weren't Deng Xiaoping in himself. They weren't Mao Zedong in what happened in 49. They even went back before 1912. There was something very strong in terms of the forces that were in a confluence at that stage. So it sounds somewhat grandiose and macro, but that is an aspect that I think one has to keep in mind when you do business in China or do anything in China. You've got to see it in a context. The country is so large, not just in physical scale and population, but in variation of culture and in the massive network of forces that drive this place. And I think one of the mistakes that people make doing business here, whether they're in a bank, a trading company, or teaching at a university, is they see their own world in a Chinese context. They bring a bubble of their own culture with them to cope in that world. And they don't really get a chance to be vulnerable to what's going on, to listen to what's going on. And I think the thing that longevity in China does to one's own makeup is that in the end, you are forced to start to listen and put assumptions aside and keep reevaluating things. And I would say if there's anything in terms of how things have worked out for my business partners and myself, they've largely been around having to adapt and learning that one needed to adapt. Because there were many setbacks. We were just getting traction and 89 came along and basically everything went. And to pull together a life here and a commercial existence in the wake of that was not easy. Although China recovered remarkably swiftly. People forget that by 1990, GDP growth in the autumn of 1990, I forget it was 6+%, something quite profound. So what I learned was that China did make big mistakes, but it wasn't repeating mistakes. Those events in 89 have not reoccurred, not because of repression, as people have tried to describe. Everyone learned from that. This doesn't work. You can't afford a revolution, and you can't afford to confront dissatisfaction and dissent in a blunt manner. So I think a lot more was learned from that time than on all sides than people give China credit for. Then there were the other great shocks that
Before you go to that, can I just pick into this just a little bit? From my own memory, 1988 was a period when inflation really started to rear its ugly head, and there were transformations in the labour market where traditional employment stability was also being turned on its head. And it was around a lot of these issues that a lot of the public concerns revolved. And I remember seeing some of the early day opinion polls, right, which barely existed before then, but around 88, 89, there were a few sporadic surveys of public attitudes around issues. And it was those two things, employment stability and inflation, underpinned by a sense that perhaps things were changing too fast. 82 through to 88, 89, the pace of reform, the turning upside down of people's ways of life really threw people into a bit of a state, and that seemed to me, from my own memory anyway, of that period to be probably the driving issue at the time. And you were in Beijing, right? So
Yeah.
you kind of lived it as well.
The months leading up, I was on the street all the time and I was talking to people. All of them said those things.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea of democracy or changing the government was only really discussed in a very small group of the students. For the rest of it, even the factories that went out on strike towards the end, it was to do with the fact that they wanted better wages, because what had hit Russia, or was hitting Russia at the time, was this asinine approach at the time by the IMF and others, the sort of Washington consensus on how to fix an economy, of everything through shock to create markets. And that was beginning to be applied, as you said, particularly 87, 88. I think inflation in December 88 was like 28%. So it was a very big deal. There was no wish to change the regime. They wanted to be listened to. And I think if you talk about what is a successful revolution, protest, it's the one that's listened to. And it was listened to. If you look at what was then part of public policy and financial economic policy afterwards, it reflected a lot of things being asked for. And China has not gone through that shock treatment ever again. The entry into the WTO was shocking to the system, but it was actually pretty well managed by the government. So, yeah, that was the key issue. And people in the West, they grafted on their own ideas, aspirations, imaginary hopes for China, very westernized, shaped wishes, and then looked at the events of 89 through that lens, like they're doing today. Because China then went into a period when it was still not certain that the party and government were committed to economic reform, and what people miss, there was tremendous bureaucratic and administrative reform as well, and social reform. But in this famous Deng Xiaoping's march to the south, which I perceived at the time, not that he was creating a new movement, he was owning one that was already well in play. And by doing that, creating political pressure on Beijing to not give any oxygen to the conservative communists in the system. So we had a period of experimentation that ran through the 90s, a period when it was difficult to keep track of what was happening because there were big changes internally. If you look at the way that state-owned industries were reformed, the cracking of the iron rice bowl, it had massive ramifications. But what I think observers at the time didn't realize, and I think what historians now miss, is that at that time, the rate at which private companies were being formed or township enterprises were becoming effectively collectively owned enterprises separate from the state meant that there were plenty of jobs. It wasn't that people went into a generation of unemployment or even some years of unemployment. They moved around the country. They found jobs pretty swiftly. So that transition was perhaps better managed than I think sometimes we give China credit for. The financial transition was equally profound when they began to restructure the banks. They were basically policy-driven allocation centers for capital. They weren't banks at all. Within the space of about 3 years, China had restructured the core state-owned banks into real banks. And by the time they listed them, these were some of the best balance sheets in the world and some of the more disciplined and government entities. And we have to reflect on the global financial crisis before we keep saying to ourselves that Western banking is vastly superior in governance and quality to Chinese banking. So those big changes kept drawing us as an aspiring business into the different sectors that were opening. We got into private equity by 93 because people were wanting to invest money in China. We knew how factories were run. We were sourcing things from them. So we were asked to advise, in one particular case, a private equity firm based out of London. Ended up raising a fund with them jointly, which was wouldn't have happened in other markets because you would have needed a long track record. But in the process of that, we've spent since then a lot of time in businesses as an investor, representing investors, and also being quite actively involved. We try and stay close to management. We try and work around or alongside the core activities in any company that we're related to. Excuse me. Very much on the basis that you really must understand the culture of a business, how it really does what it should be doing before you start assessing it or judging it. So I'd go on the road with salespeople. You'd look at the manufacturing process. You'd meet the customers. And always we've felt that foreign firms need to be allied with their Chinese partners, whether it's through investment or contractually, to know what it is they face and what they're doing. So we had a pretty interesting insight into that process through the private equity sector in the 90s.
So in those days, manufacturing was, I guess, one of the main areas that was emerging. And of course, today now, China is recognized as a global manufacturing powerhouse. In fact, arguably the only manufacturing superpower in the world. Back in the early 1990s and throughout that period to today, what are the sorts of changes that you've seen in manufacturing, and what are your sort of broad observations around work process, work culture, enterprise culture, and the role of both the state and competition in the evolution of Chinese manufacturing?
It's a very interesting question because the manufacturing that we were investing in, a diesel engine company in Zhejiang, a water heater company in Liaoning, a transformer manufacturer in Zhejiang. Apart from the transformer business, they were 1950s technology.
Mm.
And these were factories that had their own forges and lines of men with flat caps going to work. I mean, it was quite a remark. They were incomplete in their own way. They had all their own systems. They made everything for themselves largely. They were before the more sophisticated siloed supply chains that now make Chinese manufacturing so strong. There was a barrier that took a long time to get out of. In those days and throughout the 90s, the focus on the command economic past was a problem. It was about the quantity of production. It wasn't about its quality. It was about turnover. It wasn't about making a profit. So there were many of the wrong drivers in terms of the obligations of these businesses in reporting to their bosses. And even the privately owned groups suffered from that kind of thinking because that was the education they had. These were people who in the 90s weren't traveling the world. But at the same time, the inventiveness, I always found it a condescending approach from the West that the Chinese aren't inventive. You know, we in the West in the 90s were building this extraordinary computer technology. It was the early stages of telecommunications. But the actual technology that sold and was needed was immensely inventive. One example was, at that stage, the leading gas cylinder business was based in Ohio. And they made the kind of gas cylinders that you would use at a barbecue in Australia. There was a factory in Guangdong that made the same thing. It was very big, which they'd heard of. They'd seen their products around in trade shows. So through various connections, we were contacted and asked to do some due diligence on them. They were seeking a partnership with them. So I went down, looked at the factory. You never take a client to a factory you haven't seen. You've got to look at the ground first. And this huge, very messy, noisy, dirty manufacturing process, at the end of which popped very good gas cylinders. And we did a bit of a reconnaissance or due diligence. They were pretty safe. Unfortunately, gas cylinders can explode. These were not of that variety. When the engineers turned up from the US, they were stunned at the complete nature of this production line, and how people that had never seen how the West had gone through various iterations of how to make stuff like this had developed what would be enviable anywhere in the world in terms of its performance, its cost, its durability. So in a very basic sense, that was one of the first confirmations that there was an engineering intelligence in China, and inventiveness and creativity. So then we went on and we ended up picking up a fund that had been invested by some of the leading private equity firms in the world. The United Nations pension funds were an investor, and the target was a swords to plowshares deal for Chinese People Liberation Army factories stopping making munitions because they were getting out of the industrial system themselves into civilian applications. And there again, we were visiting factories, a former machine gun factory in a cleft in some mountains near Chongqing that was making nail guns. And the quality of those nail guns was so good that one of the leading businesses in Europe was very keen to buy the business. And they'd done this essentially without reference to the contemporary technology. So there was backwardness, there was obsolescence, there was great waste and pollution, but I saw this continuity of engineering, inventiveness, innovation. So when we got into the turn of this century, and we were then working a lot more broadly, and we were going into increasingly more backward areas because we deliberately decided to focus on the food sector, the agricultural sector, or technology related to it. So in the dairy sector, the horticulture sector, we've had clients, and especially in the last 25 years. So there again, I began to see innovation. I began to see engineering solutions to things which would be competitive, say, in Australasia, in apple orchards, vineyards. So throughout the system, there was this intellectual endeavor matched with a basic engineering pragmatism. And it's the fusion of those that give China its engineering and tech edge. So I think we are now on the threshold of an industrial revolution centered in technology as great as that which took place in Britain in the 19th century. But it will be even more profound in changing the world. And the West doesn't realize China is already on the threshold of that. It may be halfway across it. And most of us are still just stumbling around to try and find out where this thing begins. I think the West will, but it's a pretty cool place to be.
One of the key drivers of industrial transformations, and I'm going to come back to the labour force or the human capital piece in a moment. But the other dimension during this entire period that you've been in China is, of course, the transformation of the energy system from an environment where most towns and most villages didn't have electricity or reliable electricity to one where today we have a system which is the electrification rate of the system as a whole is amongst the fastest, if not the fastest in the world. During your time there, watching these transformations in industrial application and engineering ingenuity, in parallel to that, we saw a transformation in the energy system. What did you observe, I guess? I guess where I'm trying to get at is how has that transformation process been part and parcel of both efficiency, but also beginning to tackle that question of the dirtiness, the cleanliness, those sort of factors within this process?
Yeah, it's really interesting because, as you would remember, for years, Beijing was one of the most polluted cities in the world, largely because of emissions from coal-fired factories, power stations. Mm. The transformation has been led by the government, And this is one of the areas where the partnership of government officials and business is an uncommon one. We have no parallels in the West. The average, let's try and take another culture. Your average municipal leader in a town in France, where my son lives, is someone there because they're politicians, they want to be important, they have some ideas of social things, and they help do their best to run their municipality. The officials in China are all expert in a series of core disciplines: finance, industrial development, agriculture. There are areas where, unless you have that background and experience, you don't get the job. So when the government wants to change something, which when pollution got to a peak, and I forget the year, was it 2013? Was it 2010? But there was a woman who did a video feed, and it was a famous journalist, and she was pregnant, and she had been told that her fetus had got cancer, and it was to do with the air in Beijing, and she called it Under the Dome, and she spoke with this totally subdued, contained voice, just matter of fact, told the horrible story, and that we must do something about the air. That was a big trigger. It was so watched, and so it was a catalyst, and it gave Deng the leverage. Because if you look at Xi Jinping, the leverage. If you look at his first job as a minor official in Hebei province, one of his focuses was environment. It grew in momentum when he was in Fujian. It was highly visible in his role in Zhejiang and certainly in Shanghai, against pollution and against corruption. So I think people that really did care about this, they had their cause where they had to say, look, we've got a few years, you must fix things up. At the time of that occurring, we were managing 5 factories within 3-4 hours of Beijing: Shandong, Liaoning, and there was some in Hebei. I forget the exact places. I was there because they were part of a fund we were managing. We were there to do the audit, have a look at what's going on, to report to investors. In the towns that we visited them, in many of the towns, the factories had all stopped. They had not heeded the 2-year warning to move from coal to the available gas that was being supplied. And because they couldn't, they were shut off, just turned off. Absolutely. Shock really made a difference. So that partnership with government and business is a feature throughout all these phases we've spoken of. It's not socialism or capitalism. It needs its own ism, but it's a way that, in a positive sense, in both commerce and, in this case, the environment, things have worked. Without that government initiative, I tried to get one of the biggest carpet manufacturers, into a factory in Zhejiang just before the Great Recession. And no one wanted us because of the pollution that comes out of the printing and dyeing that goes on with a woolen carpet factory. I was involved in a farm system recent years for the dairy sector. Again, very stringent effluent standards. So these changes are now permanently part of the consciousness and obligations, consciousness of the people and obligations of the government. In terms of the workforce, I think, fortunately, until recently, the period in which people were being moved out of the state sector and going into the private sector, there was a profound rise in salaries. Not so much in the salaries of people working in white collar and administrative jobs, but working people were earning increasingly more. They didn't have the iron rice bowl of their lifetime assurance of health, education, pension, etc. Some of them had that as a legacy, but if you were below the age to qualify in any meaningful way, that's what you sought from your employer, and they had a mixed result. But we saw the steady increase in wages and the obligations of factories to pay people better. And in many ways, if you look at the drive to technology, one of the impulses has been that the country that used to be cheap labor became the country where labor was too expensive. And that's a good thing. It's the same dilemma in the countryside at the moment. Most workers are 50 or older because the kids have been so well educated, they can get work that's not walking up and down vines or ploughing a field or doing the various other manual tasks that go with agriculture. So I think it's been a good cycle, but there've been major losers as well if you're in the northeast of China, where in the end the replacement of old industries wasn't as swift and innovative as it was, say, in Jiangsu province, in Zhejiang province. When you look at the brain drain from those places, there's been a lot of suffering and a lot of people have lost. But the net of those lifted out of poverty across the board and the increase in the confidence of the security of their lifestyles, I'd say that even with the high youth unemployment rate today, we're in a position that I can't really find another example in history. It would have cost most other cultures great suffering to get where we are now.
You mentioned when you first went to Beijing, one of the things that grabbed you about the place was the sort of cultural capital of the workers. And one of the things we do know from the statistical evidence is that the educational standards of people across China has risen tremendously as well. Could you perhaps just give us a few insights, I guess, into that? You've touched on the education levels of government officials, but it seems that this next industrialization revolution wave that you're talking about is only possible because of a systemic increase in the education levels of the population at large.
That's true. And despite, as middle-class families all over the world have, with the right motives, misguided their children into studying law, finance, the usual sort of high salaried things, the amount of engineering education in China has been profound. And the number of skilled engineers is really something. So if we couldn't have had the development of EVs, of wind power systems and solar power systems, so well made, so cost effective, impacting the globe without a tremendous depth of engineering skills. So that's a very strong part of this. It's investing in a practical and applicable canon of skills in your population. I think in the leading cities, the top three cities of Shenzhen, Shanghai, Beijing, a lot of problems because people thought they can work for Goldman Sachs, they can go and work for a law firm, and in professional services, there's been a lot of good people. But I think there are too many qualifications in areas of diminishing employment, and that's a global phenomenon for an equivalent generation. Nonetheless, the number of tertiary institutions, as you know, that have been created in the last 10 years means that there are many more tools in the government's arsenal to redirect people into things that will mean they can be employed. And there are very reliable statistics that there are 25 to 30 million manufacturing jobs, not just working a machine, but understanding the computer that runs that machine no one touches. They're out there. And there is work for people, maybe they haven't been qualified for it, but if they learn from their parents and grandparents, they may leave their more comfortable second-tier coastal city and eat a bit of bitterness inland, but get the experience they want and very probably a good career in a growing industry. So China has challenges, but I think it's about being practical in terms of education. The one thing they haven't cracked, and we're an investor in a school, one of the first private schools licensed. It's now an international school. It's in Ningbo City. It's mostly Chinese students. There's a foreign school as part of it. They have green cards or they have parents with passports. The rest is, of the 2,000 kids, most are local. There is an issue of the way still in which education functions here. The emphasis on the marginal gains in exams, of rote learning, of not learning to work together and think for oneself. I'm not talking about a plethora of liberal arts tomorrow. I'm talking about the way you learn, whether it's chemistry, engineering, if your subject is statistics. There's ways of learning to think about those things as early as one can. If we think, the human intellect really evolves somewhere in our teens, that's when you have to start exercising it. Something that happens in Western systems, but still is not prevalent enough in the Chinese system. And I think there's a root to be fixed here. And in a strange way, one of China's dilemmas and contradictions, which is its demographic issues, means that the increasing smaller number of kids coming into the school system means that the government will have a lot more space and more teachers to actually think about teaching in a different way. So I have confidence they will get there. But that's one of the impediments at the moment.
The other interesting issue that you've touched upon just now is talking about that issue of moving inland, right? So a lot of the early economic development took place in those very well-known coastal cities, but there is still a substantial amount of development to take place inland. And part of your travels in the last 4 decades has actually been to get out of the big cities into agriculture and those sorts of fields. And I guess I just wanted to spend the last stanza of our discussion here today picking your brains less about the experiences of manufacturing in cities and more about your observations of what's happening in the countryside and what's happening away from the big cities that many Westerners know about.
Good question. And one that occupies probably 50% of our business. And I'd say in the next 5 years will be over 60%. We are involved in kiwi fruit, apples, berries. I've been to Xinjiang twice in the last 2 years, making it 16 trips. In 2021, I traveled for thousands of kilometers looking at Xinjiang's fruit cultivation in places in the early 90s that were deserts that took hours to go from the edge of the oasis to the mountains were now just full of fruit trees. They'd redirected water, they'd picked the right types of trees, and the fruit coming out of Xinjiang is phenomenally good quality. Not only that, the technology they're applying to the orchard systems is state-of-the-art globally. Part of this is because the government has done a hugely good job of expanding infrastructure to those areas, high-speed rail, motorways. I was in Guizhou province in 2023, and we were at a remote area, which was the poorest, still then the poorest county left in China. And the party secretary was in this very large pack house that was for packing apples. And I said to him, so I thought we met, just in the town there before. And he said, yeah, my actual job is I run this pack house. I've stepped out of my role as party secretary, and I've been given a 24-month gig where I get paid much the same, but I have KPIs of lifting 20 families out of what is basic poverty, finding ways that they are engaging in this horticultural set of these endeavors in this area and making money. And he said, we are just about to hit that target, and you'll hear this is the last province to be lifted out, last county to be lifted out of poverty. So that government focus, which is uncommon, and that local collaboration was really impressive. They have a long way to go. Getting their apples from where they are to market is a big challenge. Getting our customers or our buyers to come and look at them and contract their orchards for eventually export is also a challenge. But these rural development projects are not just nice things to stop people being poor in villages. They're moving into a consumer supply system that really is very sophisticated. As you will observe where you're in supermarkets in China, blueberries, which Driscoll's developed in Yunnan in such good quality, they used to get tremendous margins for their blueberries. Now everyone is growing in Yunnan just as well as they are. So in recent years, the price has halved and consumers get very high quality fruit. So these changes are a combination of the government's policies, but also just this hard work and aspiration of locals. You know, working with farmers in remote areas is not easy. They've got very fixed views on things. And if you want to find where corruption has been improved, the big cities, it's really out of most of people's lives. It's still prevalent in these poor areas where there's a lot of rent seeking and downward pressures on the growth there. But it can't stop what's happening. So I'm keen that as a company, we're more and more involved, not out of an ideological sense so much, well, that's part of it, but it's exciting to be in a place where things are changing here still.
One of the things about China's growth story is that in many ways it has been a beacon for other parts of the world, at least insofar as saying, you know, it can be done. But of course, China's also been adamant that its model is not designed for emulation per se. It's to address specifically Chinese related problems. Now, with those two caveats in mind, perhaps I could just ask you to reflect on your 40 years of not just observation experience, but actual skin in the game experience, and draw from that a handful of critical lessons that you think others in the world, other places that are looking for their own pathways of development could take on board, both in terms of things that can be done, but also in terms of things to avoid.
Well, we have ended up representing companies to some detail. And in doing those roles, where we're effectively managing projects for years, where things are being made or procured, and we've got oversight of the process. I will employ people on their behalf. They go in and run the factory. I've learnt something which initially I made a big mistake on, which was I thought, yeah, the foreign engineers and managers are the best. The Chinese don't really understand the best practice globally. Though there was a focus on expatriates coming in, experts coming in, whether it was running the office in Shanghai or helping in the factory in Heilongjiang, whatever the project, to then realize that that was a colonial mindset. It was missing what was really needed, which was to find and empower the local people that really had the knowledge so they could become part of your company culture. Require them to adapt to your global culture to some degree, but also make a China-focused business adapting to them. And the flux of those two, I took a while to understand properly. I don't think I started with the colonial mindset, but when I was very young and lacked the experience, I kind of was more submissive to my global clients than I later became. As I made mistakes and lost people money or didn't make enough money, I began to realize what is required here. So that kind of experience was pretty salient. And now I realize that this is a country where you need to truly have a partnership. And there's a reverse problem I'm dealing with, which is we have one client at the moment that has great prospects here, has a very good product, and we've managed to put them into a partnership with a leading business in their sector. It's a global brand. They are leaving everything to their partner. And that's the wrong attitude too. Don't just do that. Come in and work alongside them, because there are things you will know better than they know, but there are things you must learn from them so you don't end up in conflict with them. So I still find managing those margins difficult, not so much for our own endeavors, but trying to get our clients to work in that way. It's always difficult to get a cross-cultural relationship in an economy. But in China, as long as you can put aside your assumptions enough, don't come thinking it's a wonderful place, Madam Wong or Mr. Wu's marvelous and will look after me, and it's all based on trust and they think I'm great and I think they're great. Take that froth and emotion out of it. Get past the wonderful first blush of hospitality that one always comes through when entering Chinese culture, and look at it in a far more pragmatic sense. Put time in to be friends with people. Bring them to your own country. Really invest in a relationship. And then it can be like any other human relationship. So out of it, you end up thinking, well, I am here to deal with Chinese people and culture, in a human sense, measuring and using what I know of myself in a universal sense just to deal with them as people. Don't give too much mystery to culture. Don't make it an excuse. Respect it. Measure it, take it into account. But it's the universal things that you come together to make things work. So I think we're probably more in that kind of mode as a company and trying to help our clients.
Well, look, David, it's been a fascinating journey. It's only been 40 odd minutes trying to cover 40 years, so we can never quite do that justice. But you've certainly, I think, provided the viewers with a lot of insights about the trials and tribulations of economic development, particularly from the point of view of somebody who in their early days threw themselves into a country so vastly different. Thanks very much for joining me and for sharing your experience and insights, and I hope to have you back on again soon.
Thank you, Warwick. It's my privilege. Thank you.
If you liked that video, please like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps the channel. If you'd like to see more from TIO, check out the Substack link. Or if you'd like to see more from me, check out my Substack in the description.